so that's 12:01 on my watch, so I think we're ready to get going. I'm very excited for this presentation. I was mentioning to Megan, it's really great that I have all these events built into my schedule because I get to hear about comic books and medieval love and just all these fascinating topics. And so it is my great pleasure to introduce Meghan Woolley, who is a medieval historian with research specializing in the history of emotions, politics, and law in 12th and 13th century England. She holds a PhD from Duke University and a master's degree from the University of St. Andrews. Her publications include articles on royal anger and the intersection between legal documents and ritual. She is currently working on her first book project about the place of emotions and friendship in the early common law, as well as edited collections on problem solving in medieval law and on emotions, law, and performance in medieval England. So thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you all on Zoom and in person for coming. Anyone on Zoom, if at any point you can't hear me, feel free to ping the chat and I'll make sure that I'm projecting a little bit more. So I'm sharing a little bit today from that first book project. I keep going through a couple iterations of the title, but at least today, the tentative title is The Heart of Law, Friendship and Emotions in the Early Common Law, and this builds on my dissertation project. So apologies to those of you in the history department. Some of this will be familiar to things that you've already heard before, but there's some new stuff. You've got to wait for the second half. All right, so I thought I would give us first a little bit of context. Where are we? When are we in 12th century England? So this is a really important moment in the history of law and also political institutions. Sort of across Europe, we're seeing in the 12th century the growth of more centralized monarchies and the creation of more institutions of law and also record keeping, which is great if you're a historian and you need those documents. So there's a few kind of key moments that I want to highlight here in 12th century England. The first is the reign of a king named Henry I, who is sort of known for consolidating royal power and building up the English legal system. But then after his reign, there is this period of civil war that's largely called the anarchy. So you can maybe imagine from that name, it's not known for strong central government. And a lot of royal families, not royal families, aristocratic families, try to take advantage of this. And they start fighting each other, sort of grabbing land as much as they can. So then Henry I's grandson, Henry II, eventually succeeds to the throne. So one of his big tasks after this period of anarchy is to try to restore order. And he takes that upon himself as part of his personal mission. He is trying to associate justice and order with himself. So as part of this agenda, he begins what we now call the English common law. So prior to this, around England, you had sort of different governing rules, different laws in different regions. This is the first really national body of law. So the king is trying to standardize law all around England. He does things like create a body of justices who travel all around to administer justice in what's supposed to be a really sort of fair and standardized way. So I'm talking today about law and emotions, and you might sort of ask, like, emotions and law, that seems like a little bit of a weird combination, and I think that's because for centuries and centuries, the sort of typical way that we think of law is law as rational, right? Dating all the way back to Aristotle, and then right close to this time period that I'm talking about, we find legal texts that say things like, you know, law and judgment should never be influenced by hatred or by love or by partiality. And I've included a few modern headlines here too, sort of continuing this idea, right? A judge should not be angry, nor should a judge be sympathetic. So this is a really kind of popular way of how we talk about the law. But if we stop and think about it, I think there's lots of ways that we also can recognize law is emotional. So here I have a few points thinking about modern law and ways that emotions are important. There have been a lot of studies on this, things like jurors, particularly if those jurors are women or people of color, are less likely to be taken seriously by their fellow jurors if they do things like express sympathy with a defendant. In cases of rape or sexual assault, we know these are kinds of cases where jurors expect a certain kind of emotional response from a victim, and they don't convey emotions like sadness and grief they might be less likely to be believed, even though that doesn't actually align with studies about things like how shock might come into play here, for example. Defendants in really serious capital cases are more likely to be sentenced to death if they are not visibly showing remorse. So these are just a few examples of ways that we have really strong cultural norms about what emotions we expect to see and how they should be performed. And when people deviate from those scripts, it can have really concrete consequences for them. So I think it's important for us to think about the ways that we bring emotion norms into legal context. And that's important within history as well. And I think one of the reasons that we need to study the history of law and emotions is to understand the origins of some of our ideas about law as rational or law as emotional, but only in certain ways, right? Where are those ideas coming from? How did they impact people over time? So I'm certainly not the first person to talk about law and emotions. In the past 10 years in particular, both within legal studies and within the history of law, there's been a lot of new work on law and emotions. I've seen this be particularly strong when we get to the early modern period, because that's when we start to get more detailed narrative records, right? We get recorded witness testimonies, that kind of thing that really lets us get a little bit more detail. It's harder in the medieval period when we actually have fewer of those really detailed records. But I've given here a couple of examples of important works that are on medieval law and emotions. But something that characterizes a lot of this work is a focus on negative emotions, things like anger and hatred and enmity. You can see in that first book, right, rancor. So what these works are largely doing is connecting disputes within law to disputes within feud, and they're looking at emotions as sort of motivators for things like vengeance. So that's really important work, but there's a risk in this type of focus in that it can sort of essentialize emotions as these more primitive forces, right? Like, I'm so angry, I'm like overwhelmed by my anger, I must seek vengeance. So what I'm doing is I do incorporate a little bit of anger, but I'm also trying to look at emotions as productive tools. So that's why an emphasis on things like friendship and love, right? These are things that actually could build connections, could create social protection and order. One way that I'm doing that is I'm trying to place law within its broader social context and cultural context. So I'm talking today about the 12th century. Once you kind of zoom away out of law, the 12th century is often called the century of love. And there are multiple different kinds of discourses about love going on at the same time. One of those is courtly love. This is kind of the famous love, like Arthurian romance from troubadour poetry, right? Where we have an aristocratic young man trying to earn the love of an elevated lady. This is really popular in literature at the time. Once you move over to monastic communities, there's still an emphasis on love. We might call this spiritual love. So this includes a really close, loving relationship with Christ, but also an emphasis on love and friendship between monastic brothers, right? That there's this idea that love and friendship is an important part of monastic lifestyle. And then over in the political sphere, we have this concept a different historian named Stephen Jager came up with called ennobling love. This is the idea that love is sort of the bond that ties aristocratic men together, right? Love to your lord, love to your king. The concept is that love and friendship recognize virtue and charisma, and that by practicing love and friendship, we can actually be reinforcing that virtue. So I wanted to highlight these sort of three different categories, but also think of them together as part of a kind of broader cultural wave that's emphasizing love is important in multiple different realms of society. All right, so we're gonna pivot back to the law, and we might ask a kind of difficult question here, which is where can we find emotions when we look at the law? So I've included in this image, this is a picture of an official court record, and then I use that red box to highlight. That is the account of one case. So you can see it's only 3 lines. It's not a lot of information. It's quite formulaic. It does not give us a lot of like juicy details about what was going on, how did people act, what did they feel. So we can use court records, but for emotions, they're often not as helpful as, I might want. So that means in order to think about emotions, I need to use a number of different kinds of sources as well. The first one is the one I'm going to share a couple of examples from today, and that's law books. These are treatises on sort of best practices and procedures for law. A few other kinds of sources I use in my other research are chronicles. Chronicles are narrative histories, usually kept by monastic houses. And then literature and letters. Those are sources that help me sort of connect what's happening in law to what's happening in the broader culture. So like I said, today I want to talk about a couple of different law books from different moments in the 12th century, so we can also think about change over time. The first one is called The Laws of Henry I. Remember, Henry I was that sort of important king who's centralizing royal power. So this Laws of Henry I is a Latin text, and what it's doing is it's taking older English laws, some that were issued during the reign of Henry I, some that come from before the Norman conquest of England in 1066, and it's translating them into Latin. So it's trying to make them more accessible to the Norman aristocracy of England. So the author is anonymous. We don't know very much about him, but he probably was involved with the royal administration, or maybe he was like a local clerk, something like that. And he's sort of trying to give us a sense of best practices for more local court procedure. So I want to start with this, the most well-known quote about love and friendship in this text. It's what originally drew my attention to it. And what it says is, an agreement supersedes or conquers law, and love conquers judgment. So what is this idea saying, right? This is saying basically that litigants being able to come to an agreement on their own is better than a court dictating a judgment to them. And if two litigants come to an agreement on themselves, that can sort of overtake, right, can supersede other sort of preceding contracts, that kind of thing. And then it also says, right, that those agreements would be made out of love. So this is a really interesting starting point. A lot of historians have used this one sentence, sometimes taking it out of context, to talk about a preference for compromise in the 12th century. And what they've sort of talked about is that this kind of language shows a preference for settlement, particularly in the first half of the 12th century, and that by the end of the 12th century, that has shifted to a preference for official settlement, sort of dictated by a court instead. But I've just highlighted here a few of the phrases as representative of the way historians talk about this, and I wanted to highlight that what they're primarily talking about is a type of agreement, right? Compromise versus settlement. What they're not talking about as much is the potential emotional content of those agreements. And I think this is reinforced by the way that historians tend to translate the original Latin. So I've got some Latin up on the slide. Don't worry if Latin's not your particular cup of tea. But what I just wanted to show you here is that the original Latin language is often amor, right? Amor literally means love. Sometimes we also have amicitia, which translates to friendship. But then these are passages from the modern translation. The way that the translator renders this is not love. Instead, it's phrases like friendly agreement or amicable settlement. So these translations take a noun, love, and they sort of downgrade it to an adjective, right? Friendly or amicable, and they add in that word settlement or agreement. So that this feels like maybe it's really in the weeds, but I actually think that it's important because what this translator is trying to do is highlight the sort of official function that love could serve in this context, right? It could basically serve to represent an agreement in a way that our modern word love doesn't quite capture. So it is doing something important, but it's also draining it of its potential emotional power. And I think if we want to understand the role of emotions and relationships in law, we have to also consider that more emotional layer of meaning. So something that I'm trying to do is reinterpret what that language means, in part by using a little bit more of a literal translation. So let's look at a few other passages from this book, The Laws of Henry I, and we can kind of try to break down how this love and friendship is working within legal context. So this first section is a passage that's laying out the general procedures of a county court. And what it says is, those whom the county court finds in dispute with each other, it shall bring together by love, or it shall settle by judgment. So what this means is that the court assembly can dictate a settlement, or the two litigants can choose to come to an agreement on their own. So unlike a formal settlement, love might include more flexible terms that would be chosen by the litigants themselves. We have here a really similar passage that's talking about disputes between neighbors, and it prescribes that friendship shall bring them together, or judgment shall settle them. So this is the same idea, but using friendship, amicitia, instead of love, amor. So in both of these passages, I think it's worth pointing out that the verb that's used with them, the congrego, congregate there, means something like to bring together, to assemble, right, to congregate. So to me, this language is suggesting that friendship or love-based agreements are really designed to bring people together to kind of produce social unity. Also in both of these passages, we have love and friendship forming the core of an agreement. It's ending a dispute. So love and friendship are themselves a complete route to reconciliation. They even are sort of taking precedence over the court's judgment, right? I noticed in both of these, it's love or friendship that's listed first over that judgment. So to me, that suggests maybe this is seen as the preferred option. So I have another passage here. There's a couple moments in the text that show that love was meant to have full legal power and enforceability. The terms of a love-based agreement would be negotiated between disputants, but once those terms were agreed to, they were supposed to be binding. So here the text says, if someone has a case with his ally or peer and is brought together out of love between them and by witnesses on these things, they cannot nevertheless go back to the beginning of the plea and substitute a court judgment, especially if the justice was present. So a settlement that's made out of love stood as a full legal agreement. It can't be heard again. The next passage, the writer again emphasizes the importance of enforceability. So he says, where any litigant has a choice through justice of friendship or law and chooses friendship, this shall be as firm as a judgment itself. So I think the fact that the writer feels the need to repeat this a second time maybe suggests a little bit of anxiety about whether these agreements are going to be treated as enforceable as judgment, but the principle is really clear that friendship is meant to have binding legal power. There are also a couple passages that show us that love and friendship could be really powerful, particularly in more tense situations. The ability of love to add a layer of honor and harmony, right, tapping into that sense of virtue, could be really helpful, especially if you're trying to prevent violence. So one of these contexts was cases of murder or manslaughter. So in these cases, kind of to prevent feud, the typical strategy is the murderer should pay weregeld, basically a set amount of money, to the victim's family so that the victim's family doesn't want to seek revenge and create a feud. This is in a manslaughter case, sort of an accidental death. So the text describes how ideally, once the weregeld had been paid, the parties will have restored friendship between them. And then after laying out the sort of technical procedure for payment, the text states that the concerned parties may proceed by way of love if they wish to have the complete freedom of friends to come and go. So what's happening here? First, the payment of that weregeld, it fulfills the basic legal obligation. Then establishing love goes beyond that to create something positive, right? To create friendship and freedom. So what I think it means when it says proceeding by way of love, I think it means, right, these two people might make a declaration of mutual friendship. That might be left ambiguous, or it might even include specific services that these parties might owe to each other in the future. And essentially, it provides that ability to move freely, right, without fear of revenge, without fear that if you're walking through the marketplace someday, someone from the victim's family is going to attack you out of nowhere. Establishing this friendship serves to expand the capacity of the law to produce social harmony, right? And this might be especially important following a homicide where we're really worried that there's going to be ongoing violence. So love and friendship kind of serve as the counter to that violence. All right, so I want to sort of wrap up what we've seen about love and friendship in our first text, the laws of Henry I. How is love or friendship kind of working emotionally? So first, it's presented as a sort of preferred and also full path to settlement, not just as a kind of supplement or a modifier to agreements. It's also meant to be enforceable, right? Courts took these agreements seriously, and they were designed to be set and enforced by justices. All right, and why were love and friendship so important? What are the benefits that people are getting from them? First, love and friendship are unifying, right? They tap into an ability to grant honor, to soothe shame, and create unity. So that emotive power, I think, is actually really important to why people are drawing on love and friendship to create these agreements. And importantly, love and friendship are supposed to be lasting, right? A settlement that comes down from a judge or an assembly resolves one particular dispute, but love and friendship should extend beyond any one particular case to create ongoing benefits in a relationship. All right, so I want us to talk about one other text. The full title is Treatise on the Laws and Customs of the Realm of England, composed in the time of Henry II, when justice was under the direction of the illustrious Ranulph Glanville. More simply, Glanville. So Glanville he was the Chief Justiciar of England. Originally, this text was attributed to him. We now think he probably didn't write it, but it's been associated with his name for a long time. This was written in the 1180s. So this is after that first wave of reforms that established the common law, right? So the legacy of the laws of Henry I was before the common law. This text is after those reforms, and it's talking primarily about the King's Court. So it is much more representative of a sort of centralized royal perspective on law. But it has a really different interpretation of love and friendship. I want to start with a couple of kind of parallel passages between Glanville and laws of Henry I, so we can consider how different they are. So this first one, Glanville overall focuses a lot less on voluntary settlements, but there is some discussion of them. So here, when discussing concords made in the King's Court, it lays out the possibility that cases might end with the two parties choosing to come to an agreement. So in some ways, this is really similar to how parties in the laws of Henry I would come together out of love. But here, this is being formalized as part of new common law forms of an agreement called an amicable composition or a final concord, right? It says, it often happens that cases begun in the Lord King's Court are ended by an amicable composition, final concord, subject to the consent and license of the Lord King or his justices. Such a concord is generally written down in a chirograph. A chirograph is just a particular form of a document that it's mirrored, so each party can take a copy. It goes on and on after this, laying out sort of examples of what a chirograph might look like. It's really focused on the procedural details of how you create this document. This is actually one of the first references to a final concord. So we might understand this as basically the common law formalizing the type of unofficial settlement that litigants used to come to, right? And it takes, now we've got a kind of standardized form that you complete, I have done an analysis of some of these final concords in the 13th century, and I have to tell you, they're really dry. They're really formulaic. So even though in some ways we could understand them as an evolution of the love-based settlements we just looked at, there's really no language of emotions, love, and friendship within those documents themselves. So we have kind of a pivot here towards a much more formulaic, less emotional type of agreement. And this is mirrored in the shift in language that we can see, right? So we go from friendship, amicitia, to friendly. So now we have that adjective, right? Amicable composition. This is kind of more similar to the way that historians actually are translating the earlier text. So I think there might be an element of historians projecting backwards a little bit from the way that it's written later in the 12th century. So let me show you one other example of kind of a parallel structure. There's another passage that echoes the philosophy from the laws of Henry I on agreements, but at the same time draining it of emotional power. So when discussing the sale of land, Landville states that parties, if they choose to, could withdraw from their contract as long as they both agree, because, quote, it is a general rule that agreement prevails over law. So this is an echo of the same sort of famous principle from laws of Henry I, right, that love supersedes judgment, but it took out that last bit about love, right? It only has the bit of agreement, and it's left off this final bit at amor judicium, right? Love conquers judgment, right? So we still have agreements, but no love. So I think what we have to ask is, can we tell what the writer behind Landville thought about love, right? We've got a couple examples of the absence of love, but why, right? So I think we get a glimpse of this in a discussion in the text on inheritance. So in 12th century England, the kind of system of inheritance is called primogeniture. It means that the oldest son inherits all of the father's oral holdings, versus like the father being able to split it amongst all of his children. So for a landed aristocracy, the way that land is inherited is really, really important, and you want that system to be sort of predictable and dependable, and Landville is very concerned about this. And he views a father's love of his younger sons as a potential threat to this system. So he says, if he, the father, has several legitimate sons, he can hardly give any part of the inheritance to a younger son without the heir's consent. For if this were allowed, the disinheritance of eldest sons would often occur because of the greater affection which fathers tend to have for younger sons. Yeah, as an older sibling myself, I can understand where this is coming from. So I think it's worth looking at the language here. The previous passages we've talked about use vocabulary of love and friendship, and here there's a pivot to affection instead. Within the Middle Ages, this word affection, affectio, usually it's synonymous with our modern word of affection, but it particularly means more of a temporary upheaval of feelings. Something like friendship or love is a long-term bond, and affection, almost the way we use like affect theory today, is more like a temporary feeling that could pivot into something else. It could transform into something else. So I think here, right, the writer is using affection to sort of emphasize this difference from the more sort of long-term, stable principles that, you know, should characterize good law. This passage is really the only glimpse we get into any sort of usage or reference to love or friendship within the whole text. So, love and friendship in Glanville, mostly it is avoided. It's rarely mentioned. When we do get a hint of affection, of relationships, of personal bonds, they are framed as sort of risky, right? As unstable, as a potential threat to law and inheritance. So where I'm going from here, because this is part of a chapter that I'm still working on, I'm going to look at a couple of other later legal treatises, but the overall picture that we have so far of emotions in the common law is we want to think of law as rational and as impartial. This is actually something that's mentioned over and over again. Our judges are always going to be impartial. That's sort of like a key perk of the common law. They're also looking at law as documentary, as administrative. There's this huge emphasis on procedure, on making sure that you've got the right writ, you've got the right document. And then this last one, I'm thinking about why, right? It's important to me not to assume that this way of valuing law as rational and impartial is just sort of the default as built into law, right? Law is constructed by people, it's made by people. So why this kind of draining of the language of love and friendship? My thought, my argument is that this is an important way to shift power away from local social networks, from local lords, right? A local lord running his own court might be really influenced by his relationships with the people around him. But if instead it's some royal judge who's traveling around all of England, he's less embroiled within local politics and local relationships. This is supposed to be a really important part of how justice is working, right? It's supposed to be more fair. But I think also what it's doing is taking power from those local social networks and instead orienting them around the king, right? The king and his successors are trying to control the law. They want that justice and power to be coming from them. And the more that they can undermine local relationships, the more that they can sort of control the way that things are working and also control the income that they're getting from running this system. So that's something that I want to talk about more and think about more as I continue to work on this project. But now, of course, right, we have to ask, all right, we've got these texts that we just read are theory, right? They're about how law should work. Law should be rational. But, you know, does that work, right? Like in practice, can that really work out? Can law ever really be impartial? This is the question that I'm hoping to answer in the rest of the book. I mean, short answer, no, right? Like the law doesn't necessarily exist, right? But like people exist, and people can never be totally rational or impartial. So the sort of snippets I've just shared with you come from the first two chapters of the book project. The rest of the chapters are going to be looking at different elements of law in practice, focusing on different kinds of parties, right? The king, sort of normal litigants, secular litigants, religious litigants, and also a class of lawyers, new professional lawyers that emerged in the 13th century, and where we can see emotions coming into practice with these different groups here. So I've got a chapter on when the king, sometimes he is judging personally over the most elite cases, and I look at his anger being really important in the way that he kind of administers and performs those judgments. This next one is a new chapter that I haven't written yet, but what I'm looking at is I want to take those really procedural documents, right? Common law is all about you gotta follow the right procedure. How do people take those procedural forms and manipulate them and use them to actually align with their emotions and their social networks? So things like you're allowed to delay coming to court if you're sick, right? But people in practice will do things like, oh, my friends can't come to court today, so I'm gonna wait until 3 months later when they can come and I can show up with a full sort of social network and support, that kind of thing. The next one that focuses on monks. I have these great sources where they're doing things like they're writing letters saying, we're so sad because we're losing our legal case. Won't you please overturn this judgment that went against us? And they actually talk in some of their texts about how they intentionally strategize together. We are going to write a letter talking about how sad we are. So I think there's a self-consciousness that they are actually using emotional narratives to try to manipulate the legal system through their connections. And then the last one is research I have upcoming, so I haven't looked at these sources yet, later in the 13th century, we get this big collection of lawyers' reports. So these are right, this new class of lawyers, and they're basically writing commentaries on different cases. So this is some of the first like behind the scenes that we get to the official court record. So I want to look at these and say, okay, how are those lawyers viewing people's relationships? Do they see them as advantages, right? Do they see them as obstacles? Are they thinking about how to move around them? So yeah, so this is what the kind of book project as a whole will look like, and kind of pair the more legal theory stuff we talked about with law and practice. And because I'm still working on this, I would love if any of you have questions, we can talk about it more. And so I will end there. Yeah, questions, thoughts?
I've got a comment sort of chewing on for the second half of your presentation. So I'm really intrigued by this idea that settlements made in love and friendship like had a different or a better enforcement mechanism or durability. And I'm like, it occurs to me that probably the other enforcement mechanisms for making a durable settlement are more like sticks and less like carrots.
Yeah.
Right? So like if you do this again, or you break the settlement terms or whatever, you're gonna get punished further. Could you talk a little bit about how, like, why that matters?
Absolutely. Fantastic question, because reputation is so important within medieval society. So like I said, this is a legal context where documents are becoming more important, but it's also still largely an oral culture, and these hearings would have been really sort of public community events. So actually, we have already in the 12th century a system of a jury. What that means is, right, 12 men are required to come, and these are sort of your like land-holding local men are required to come. Other people are also coming to listen to these hearings. So I think that the sticks, of course, there's official sticks, right? You could, if you committed a crime, you could be paying fines, you could lose a hand, you could be hanged, but especially for smaller cases, the other sticks I think are shame, right?
So not necessarily a carrot. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, and I think that shame and enmity, right, those are the flip sides to love and friendship. And we know, right, from some of those other studies I talked about too, right, people might bring a charge to court that maybe they don't even anticipate fully prosecuting, but they want to come and make their claim in public because it hurts your reputation. It hurts your ability to maybe make agreements, friendships with other people in your local community. I think that's also a really important part of how the law is being used.
Yeah. Or you said we're friends, and now you're going back on that.
Exactly.
And I was wondering how much that connects with what you were saying about like contemporary affect theory having an idea that emotions fluctuate or change, whereas it sounds like what you're describing here is in this period, in this place, there's an idea that emotion is somehow more lasting, right? That like if you are shamed, that continues, or if an agreement is reached in friendship or love, like the idea somehow that is that's sort of like a permanent condition almost. Am I understanding that right?
That's exactly right. I'm going way back because I want to pull up one of my early slides. Right, these texts don't say, when they say make an agreement out of love, they don't say, here's how you do that, right? Like follow these 4 steps. I think that ambiguity is intentional because they probably want to leave it open-ended for people to define their own terms. But I think it's very likely in practice that these people would have been making oaths to each other. They might be making an oath of friendship, which, just like what you're saying, is supposed to be lasting and permanent. So I pulled up this slide because I wanted to look at the image on the far right is 2 kings making a kiss of peace, which I think is like the emblematic combination between like ritual and emotions here. Say that you are at war with someone or you have a legal disagreement, you would typically resolve that at the end by making a kiss of peace, which is a kiss on the lips, right? But it's a Christian ritual, right? It's tied to right, this is something that you could do in Mass as well, right? The kiss of peace. It's supposed to be a gesture of love, but it's also a symbolic gesture, right? Like here we are making our agreement. Everyone is watching us do this. And yeah, if you go back on the piece, that's a big no-no, because it's supposed to be, it's a sign that you've undertaken in front of God, and it's supposed to be permanent.
I have 2 questions. Thank you for the talk, Megan, it was great. So one's like really kind of minor, but for the laws of Louis the first kind of case that you were talking about, and you were talking about the fact that it's written in Latin specifically to sort of make it more accessible to the Norman kind of contingent.
Yeah.
Do you see any concessions to either French or Roman law?
Yeah, really good question. Yeah.
In relation to emotion?
Yeah. There are some connections, particularly later once we get to the common law, later in the 12th century. They're absolutely drawing in Roman law as well, because that's sort of, influential, right? We have all basically these educated members of the church who are going to like Italy, to the University of Bologna, they're studying Roman law, and they come back, so that's informing particular canon law in the church, but there's sort of like messy overlap between like canon law and common law, the sort of civil and criminal law. So it's absolutely influential. The French is a really interesting question. There's actually a different text from later in the 12th century. No, it's from the very start of the 13th century that I'm planning to look at next, which is written in French. And so it's a commentary on the common law in England, but we think it was circulating in Normandy, right? Because this is an elite group of people that's kind of going back and forth between England and France. They're French speaking. So there is definitely an awareness that this like needs to be sort of made accessible to French speaking people as well. And there might be connections to what's happening in sort of greater, France, as well, which I don't know as much about, but I think that definitely there's possible connections happening there too.
Yeah. And my second question is, so I mean, I'm sold on this idea that, like, Henry II is sort of centralizing kind of power. Historiographically, that's how it's usually depicted, right? And my hazy understanding is also kind of building up a bureaucracy, right? Yeah. So I would wonder if you could even take your argument further. So it's not just that he wants to kind of move kind of decision-making power from local courts to kind of judges, but also like no one has sort of an escape route of avoiding the courts, right?
Right.
So there's a form of potentially a surveillance, a kind of awareness that he's kind of constructing this on it.
Yeah. I like that phrasing. I think that's exactly right. I'm thinking about this argument and how much I can like support with evidence, right? But I almost wonder if something that happens here is there is this really intentional emphasis on we're getting rid of emotions, we're being so rational, but it actually, one of the products of that is like a surveillance of emotions that actually then starts to formalize emotions as part of this process and this sort of like part of like who you are as a legal subject. There are limitations, it's not something I focused on today, but there are formal limitations within the common law on particularly things like hatred and enmity, and there are actually procedural elements. So if you think someone has brought a case against you and it's not legitimate, right? It's based out of enmity. There's a whole procedure for you to say, I say that this charge is not real, it's brought out of enmity, and then there's a full investigation into whether we can find evidence of preceding enmity. So there's actually this procedure for this one particular part to say, like, can we find anger, can we find hatred within your social context, right? So there's this investigation into emotions. So I think, right, there's sort of like an emotional subject being kind of formalized here as part of this procedure.
Am I going to be able to articulate this? I mean, did they see those things as emotions? Right? Are they just rationalizing emotions?
Yeah.
Or like, what did they consider to be rational and emotional when they probably weren't using those words, right? So like, I don't, and this is not meant to blow up your joint here, but like, like it's an interesting question, especially if you're thinking, like to Lauren's answer there, like, if they're actively proceduralizing certain types of things that we at least consider emotions, like, does that put them in a different non-emotional? Like,
yeah, no. This isn't really important. It's such a hard question to answer, but I think it is actually like a fundamental question of my entire approach. I'm using the word emotions. People in the 12th century were not using the word emotions. That's not like a term that they might talk about passions or movements or feelings. So this is a really good point. That's something like enmity, right, or hatred we might think of as a feeling, they might be looking at primarily as a pattern of behavior. And I think it's a really good question actually to say how much is the concept of emotions like the primary way that we should look at that. I think it's only part of the understanding. It's one of the reasons, originally with this project, my dissertation title is like emotions in the common law. I put emotions and friendships in the updated version, partly for this reason, that I want to be emphasizing the relationships, not just the feelings, because I think that is really important to how medieval people understood what was happening. And there's been, where's the slide? This Consumption of Justice book. So you can't see the title, but anyway, this author, Dan Smale, he has a lot of work on enmity, and he calls it a social institution rather than an emotion. So to me, I think it's important to keep that layer of emotion in there, because I want to be paying attention to feeling, and to sort of like embodiment is also like an important part of this experience, but it's definitely not the whole picture.
Yeah, but I bet that people, like, I mean, history of emotion is its own, not just in medieval law, but history of emotion is its own theoretical historiography. I mean, this must be a question that everybody is wrestling with.
Yeah.
In some way or another.
Yeah, all the time. And there are some historians who do history of emotions, but avoid the word emotion for that reason, right? They talk about like sentiments or passions to try to align with like more medieval ways of thinking about it. To me, I do think it's worth bringing things that we would call emotions together in a way that gets at some of the like more institutional stuff, the enmity, and also like things that we might think of as more like an emotional outburst, like anger. Like I think it's important to bring those into conversation, but it's like a really tricky problem if we approach it. Yeah.
Do you, is there any sort of set of guidelines for generating love when, the natural emotion, if you're in a suit, would be not that love for the other person?
Yeah.
Are you watching Judge Judy? Is any guidelines?
How do you convert your anger and enmity into love? Yeah, great question. I mean, I don't think that there is a like, here's well.
Or is the assumption that you love everyone? You're just having a bit of a bumpy ride here.
I think there is a sense, and not in these texts, but in other texts I've read, there is actually a really keen awareness of the difficulty of transforming something like anger. There's this, I wrote an article, one on royal anger, where it's a sort of like clerical, a religious advisor to the king, and he writes this whole treatise about anger and about how hard it is to convert your anger into things like mercy. And I think that the sort of Christian practice is a really important part of that, right? Like we should be loving our neighbors. We should be able to sort of like draw on this well of universal Christian love. And I think that's probably a key part of it. But sometimes there is a really keen sense that like, actually this is really hard to do. And I think that's why you have to perform it. This is one of the reasons I want to talk about emotions as emotions, because I think based on modern theories of emotions, right, there's this idea that when you do something like you perform a kiss of peace, it's very easy for us to view that as sort of like a hollow ritual gesture. But modern theories of emotions sort of say, well, when you perform an emotion, it actually has an impact on your body, right? And on the way that you feel inside, which isn't necessarily a one-to-one connection. If I kiss you, I might actually internally go like, ew, I hate you so much. But that is still like an emotional response. There's something to it that's not just the gesture, but that also is felt, and that's important too. Does anyone on Zoom have I want to make sure you guys have the option if you have any questions. Matt, did I cut you off? Did you have a question?
What's that?
Did you have a question?
I did, but I want to defer to, well, I'm not sure. So, I mean, this is just, I was thinking about this, especially as you were mentioning these kind of other legal contexts, right? and it made me think about the very beginning of your talk. You're saying there's a kind of historical reason for why this particular period is less studied in these terms than, say, the early modern period might be in available sources. And I know that, you know, the profession being what it is, right, there are good reasons for why someone would want to focus on a very specific kind of context and not necessarily to equate that context with others. However, I mean, I'm also wondering about, have people studied other, not just European, I'm thinking about like Islamic law or something like that. Like, have people studied the relationship between emotion and law, not necessarily in a kind of Judeo-Christian tradition, but others? And is there any sense in which that's helpful for you as a oh, it's not like that here, right? Or I'm just curious about kind of cross-cultural ideas about law and love.
Yeah, there is, the one that comes to mind first is Scandinavian law, and looking at love there. The sources for that are literary, right? They're looking at sagas, and they're looking at the like literary representations of legal disputes. And that's one that actually does have like a concrete connection to English law, because there's like a big Scandinavian presence in England. I think that there are, the 12th century is, I think, still, even for other kinds of law, early, but there absolutely are studies of law outside, like emotions and law outside of this tradition, and like friendship in particular, right? Like, I think there's been really good studies on like friendship in Iberia, and connections to law just a little bit later. But I think, yeah, there's approaches there that I think also are really sort of helpful for this kind of project. But it's not, I swear, I think I've seen stuff on Islamic law and emotions as well. I just couldn't tell you exactly what period they're focusing on, but that kind of thing I think might be worth looking at more.
Can I ask one pedantic thing? Could you go back to the slide that shows the timeline, like Henry I? What happened in 1153? What happened between? Yeah, it's like there's the anarchy, and then there's Henry II.
There's a brief period. So basically, it's the civil war is between Henry I's daughter Matilda and his nephew Stephen. And there's a brief period of peace where Stephen and so Henry II is the son of Matilda. They make a peace agreement. So the war ends, and then 2 years later, Stephen dies, and Henry becomes king. So that's why. So there's like a brief period where they're not fighting anymore before Stephen dies. And their agreement basically is that Stephen's son has recently died, so they agree that Henry will inherit after Stephen dies. Yeah.
I was just very curious, like, well, you had the anarchy, and then there's something else. Oh, there's a pre-anarchy.
I didn't
that's right. Yeah.
Poor Stephen, I didn't even put his name on the slide. He gets kind of short. I think Stephen was a nice guy in bad circumstances. Yeah, he's got a couple years of sort of more peaceful rule.
I have a question. So briefly, you showed us the handwritten sort of summary of court cases that are really kind of short.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering, so visually it kind of looks like that was probably all written at the same time, right?
Yes.
And so I was wondering, has anyone, I mean, this is maybe an unanswerable question, but like for the, I guess, court clerk who's like writing this down, I mean, is there any kind of incentive or pressure on him to kind of maybe either minimize or emphasize emotional language in these court descriptions?
Yeah, I think probably, right? Because like I said, these are very formulaic, and by the time we get them, they're a couple layers removed from what actually happened in court, right? So depending on who's participating in these cases, they would have been spoken in English and or French. These texts are written in Latin. So the clerk is already like translating, reducing down. And I think, yes, right? I think that there's probably really set like, this is the procedure we're supposed to follow. This is the information we need. Just include that, right? Like, our parchment's really valuable. We don't have room here to elaborate. So yeah, I think probably the clerks are being trained to not include that kind of information. If only we had more.
It doesn't have to
Well, that was fascinating. Thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us online.
You've got a busy day today.
It was so much talking.
I'll see you at 4.
Yeah, meetings. Yeah, but thank you all so much for coming and for talking about this.
Nice to hear a lot.